feel free to use the chat button if you want to ask me a quick question. I'll try to keep paying attention to it. But also feel free to jump in and say, hey, I've got a question as we're going through this. And since we don't have a lot of folks on the call, maybe very quickly, each of you could introduce yourself with your organization and your role. And I'll just call you out so that way you know that I'm reaching out to you. So we'll start with you, Andrew.
Andrew Braun, I'm the Vice President of the Brain Injury Association of Delaware.
Thank you. Emily? You gotta unmute yourself there.
Sorry about that. Hi everyone, I'm Emily Swick, Executive Associate for Board Relations and Development at the Delaware Art Museum.
Great, thank you. Pam?
I'm Pam Cornforth, President and CEO of the Ronald McDonald House of Delaware.
Great to see you. Lou?
I'm Lou Salvadori. I'm Executive Director of the Wilmington Youth Rowing Association.
Great. Cheryl?
Hi, I'm Cheryl Christensen from Family Promise of Northern Newcastle County, a program for families experiencing homelessness.
Thank you. Megan? Unmute there.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Megan Greenberg. I'm the new Executive Director of the Delaware Bar Foundation.
Welcome. Catherine?
Hi, I'm Catherine Ballweir from the Delaware Art Museum. I actually was at the Delaware Art Museum at one point. I'm at Archmere Academy, and I'm the Director of Institutional Advancement.
Great. Carol? You need to unmute there. I'll unmute you. There you go. Gotcha.
I'm Carol Bailey. I'm Chair of Literacy Delaware Board of Directors.
Wonderful. Good to see you. And let's see, we've got Christy.
Good morning. I'm the Executive Director for the Brain Injury Association of Delaware.
Welcome. Anne?
Good morning. I'm the Executive Director of Delaware Nature Society. Sorry, if I turn on my video, I lose the good sound connection. So my apologies, but I'm really happy to be with all of you and thankful that Dana is providing so much support for all nonprofits. Thanks so much.
Vikram.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Vikram Krishnamurti. I'm the Executive Director at the Delaware Center for Horticulture, and I have the same challenge as Anne this morning for some reason with my Wi-Fi, so just using audio.
Thank you. Jennifer.
Hi, my name is Jennifer So. I'm the Deputy Director at the Mental Health Association in Delaware, and ditto with Anne and Vikram there.
Thank you. And Stephanie.
Good morning, everybody. I am a youth advisor at YWCA, and I actually was just on Facebook and saw this, and I said, you know what, I need to listen in. So thank you so much.
Well, welcome. It's possible we may have a few folks that pop in. Again, I'm going to kick this off. If you are able to mute yourself, please mute yourself. And then when you have a question, feel free to unmute, and we'll take it from there. So I'm going to share my screen, because I find it's a lot easier if I have a PowerPoint in front of me. All right. And let me move this to PowerPoint. I think, here we go. Okay. Well, I think many of you know who we are, so I won't spend time on about us. I put down that, you know, we usually have this slide, but I have to say that we've really tried to become a resource for nonprofit leaders around COVID-19 and how we, you know, need to think about things in the future, and that's really what today's presentation is about. I really have to give a big shout out to our alliance partners. I guess that many of them are probably funding partners for you as well. They have been tremendous in this response. I have the pleasure of working with many of them on the COVID-19 emergency response initiative, which includes the efforts of the United Way, the Delaware Community Foundation, and Philanthropy Delaware, and then many of Philanthropy Delaware's members. And just the support that they've given. Many of them have unrestricted dollars. They've reached out to their grantees. So I encourage you that if you've not done so already, please reach out to them, let them know how you're doing. If you've got questions about upcoming funding, or let's say they were supporting a program that you had and you can't deliver that program right now, talk to them about it, because they may be willing to allow you to divert those funds in a different manner. Today, I'm going to cover a couple of things, just an overview of the Delaware landscape in light of COVID-19, talk a little bit about factors that influence sustainability, and then wrap it up with some leadership considerations. So just a reminder, unfortunately, we always have to remind our elected officials this, because they care a lot about the economy. And often when our elected officials think about the economy, they'll think about businesses. So it is important that we remind them that we are part of the economic equation as well. And some organizations like ARTS, for example, actually have really good data that shows how their organization's activities drive economic impact in the state. I encourage you to think about how you can share that same message with your elected officials. It's certainly going to come in handy as we go forward in the budget conversations with the state of Delaware. And here's one example of how we roll it all up. And you might want to think about how you could put your organization into that context. Just to let you know what's happening across the state, about 78% of nonprofits in our last survey that we conducted are operating in some fashion. About the remaining are not able to be open, and many of them, unfortunately, are arts and cultural institutions, as well as some of the education organizations that might not have access to online programming at this time. Dana conducted 2 surveys, one in mid-March when we first went into the state of emergency, and then 3 weeks later at the beginning of April. Since then, the Chamber have put out a couple of surveys, and we opted to really encourage nonprofits to participate in that, because it does start to give a comprehensive view. And the results of that just came out yesterday, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a sneak peek. Dana probably will do another survey once we understand what the governor's plans are for emerging out of the shelter in place, because at that point will be, folks will know a little bit more about what they can and can't do and the timeline. So first of all, as I mentioned, about over 3/4 have been able to offer some type of services. I think the one thing that really surprised me is not everybody in our surveys was able to give us a dollar figure of how much they had lost in revenue, assuming kind of a May 15th reopening at the time. But about 115 did, and they collectively indicated over $20 million in lost fundraising and program revenue. So we've aggregated that up based upon, percentage of nonprofits that work in the state. And our message to state government has been an estimated $100 million of economic impact, lost revenue for nonprofits. And that is an important data point as we, again, begin conversations with our elected officials. Unfortunately, and Emily's on the call here, the arts and historical organizations really took a hit, but also from the business community, we've seen a really large closures in retail and food service. And those tend to have a lot of employees, which is why you're seeing such large unemployment figures that are popping up and that have been in the news. As far as available cash on hand, over half of nonprofits that we surveyed indicated they had less than 4 months. And again, that was the beginning of April. So that would get them into, July, let's say. About a third had less than 10 weeks, which would get them to midway. The business community in total is averaging about 12 weeks. So we're kind of all in this together as it relates to cash on hand. The good news is that instruments like the Payment Protection Plan, the HELP loans, the emergency disaster loans were quick infusions of cash opportunities for businesses and nonprofits. And if you've not taken advantage of them, I encourage you to explore them. I recognize taking on debt can sometimes be a scary thing, But in the cases of the PPP, for example, that is forgivable as long as you spend it on your payroll and some other things. So just really want to encourage you to take advantage of resources that can help keep your organization operating during a time where revenues are not coming in. As of the end of March, Delaware was at a 5% unemployment, and that's compared to about 3.9 before we moved into this pandemic. It's estimated it's going to jump up to between 10 and 15%. We won't know April's numbers until mid-May, but it certainly is a factor when we start to think about forecasting what the landscape looks like. Just to give you a little historical perspective, back in the Great Recession, you can see that big jump of the orange and blue lines. That was the unemployment levels during the recession. Unemployment, the recession in 2008 and 2009 was a little bit of a longer period of time, over I think it was like 18 months. But you definitely saw that unemployment hit. It hit its highest in 2009, right at around 9.8, 10%. And the where we are, we had an economist come in on Friday, and they're projecting that those unemployment numbers will rise. For us, the big issue is just it just happened so quickly. The other thing that I wanted to point out, because it really gets into when we start to think about sustaining our organizations, is to start to think about what could the climate look like for our organizations as we move forward. And I wanted to share the stock market features, because the Great Recession is a marking point where you can look back and say, great, okay, this is how we had to operate during the Great Recession. But I wanted to highlight some things that are a little bit different as of right now. I always have to say as of right now, because this definitely continues to evolve. When the Great Recession hit, it was really the markets that took the hit, the financial industries. And you can see that huge plummet. And so what happened is people's portfolios shrunk considerably, their retirement plans and market capitalization compressed. So from a nonprofit standpoint, where we were benefited from contributions from major gift donors and definitely from a lot of banking institutions, we felt that impact. So far, even though there was a bit of a dip when we moved into the state of emergency across the country, the market really has not tanked as it had before. And a lot of it has to do with the federal policies around trying to keep cash flowing in currency. So as long as the financial institutions and are able to continue to buy and borrow and do all the things that they do in the banking world, the estimates from what the economists were sharing us is that the market may not have the kind of impact that it did. Consequently,
a question about that.
Yeah.
So they're predicting a recession in 2020 last year, or they've been doing it for the past couple of years. Is that expected to still be an issue, or is this just completely wiped out any issue that was a concern before?
There's not yet complete agreement of whether we are in a recession currently or for how long we will be in a recession. The economists and by the way, we are putting that recording on our website if you want to hear it. What she shared is that she anticipated that the rest of 2020 will be soft. I mean, it could be even recessionary going into 2021. Our DFAC economists, that's the Delaware Finance Advisory Committee that guides the state budget process. The meeting they had in April was a little more optimistic. They were thinking a little bit more of a hockey stick type recovery, where by fourth quarter things would be much stronger. Wilmington Trust economist was not as optimistic, and a lot of that has to do with the speed in which people will be able to go back to work and in which businesses can rebound. I think they're not as optimistic given the huge amount of job loss that took place. So, when you think about markets, what her thought was that, yes, there's going to be kind of like a zigzagging going on with the markets, but it's not going to be the steep plunge that we saw in the recession period. because again, there's a lot of this. The Trump administration is really working hard to keep the financial market solvent, because that's such a big factor and impact. And I think the reason why you tie it back to nonprofits is that when we look at revenue loss during the Great Recession, the biggest area of loss was investment income. So for arts and historical organizations, nonprofits that had great reserves, that's where they saw such a huge hit. And quite frankly, it took years for that income revenue to come back from investments. The other area that was hit was in the fundraising, as expected. Your donors, they lost jobs, but a lot of them also lost their portfolios. So their ability to make gifts also reduced. So when we think about this time period, as long as the markets hold, one, our investments may be a little softer than they have been in the last couple of years, but they're not going to jump down at the level as before. And then, I think we can expect that donations are going to drop, primarily because there are a lot of people that are out of work, and it may take a while before they feel that they've got those extra dollars to be able to contribute. And let me just think, did we have a question here? Sorry, I'm trying to look here. If you have a question, just shout it out, because I have a hard time seeing it. The one thing about donations I did want to point out, and again, it may not be surprising, but when you get into these types of situations where a lot of people are losing their jobs, there's a lot of stress, we do find that donations are directed more towards critical needs. So you can see how donations really increased in that health and human service space. Healthcare is lower. We purposely, for this analysis, I should have said this up front, took hospitals and universities out of the equation because they are so huge in Delaware relative to all of the others. Delaware is like a $6 billion in revenue. About $4 billion of that is hospitals and universities. So in order to be able to see a little more clearly, we strip out the hospitals and universities. Healthcare is lower because that includes mental health. And from what we've heard, that was an area that wasn't really getting the kind of support it felt it needed. The one big thing that we did see during the recession was program revenue. Human services and healthcare grew because there was a lot of funding coming from the federal government to shore up things like Medicare, Medicaid. And so their programmatic revenue grew. Also in education, it grew. Delaware benefited from the race to the top dollars. It was one of the first states. So revenue from programs was really important. I think this time around, because the COVID-19 situation makes our gatherings, physical presence, one-on-one type interactions going to be probably not the way it was. This is an area that I think we need to look at as nonprofits as to how our program revenue is going to be softer going forward relative to what might have assumed in the past. So that's kind of a quick overview of the Delaware landscape as we know it today. Things are changing fast. We had hoped the governor would provide a little bit more of a longer term rollout plan on how the Delaware economy will reopen up. As of now, he's doing it in incremental steps. So wait and see. We are on a weekly call with a member of the governor's team to kind of raise issues about what's happening in the sector, but also to hear what they're working on so that we can translate that back. So if we hear anything, we'll make sure that you know it. So here's a quick question. So for those of you who've been on mute, you can unmute. How do you know when we talk about a sustainable nonprofit, what would be words to describe that?
Solvent.
Relevant.
No, I think she said solvent.
Oh, solvent. Oh, that too.
Yes.
What other things come to mind?
Financial sustainability.
Financial
That's
health,
in there.
right?
I agree with that.
Adaptability.
Adaptability.
Innovation.
Innovation, innovative.
Stable.
What was that word?
Stable leadership.
Stable.
like a
Stable leadership, yeah.
governance. I mean, actually more healthy governance so that you have stable leadership.
Right, right. Yeah, all of those factors come into play. It's been really interesting. I'm on the council for the DCF COVID-19 Response Fund, and, you know, talk about amazing. That fund came online, I think we started it 2 or 3 weeks after the governors went into the emergency, and they're turning out grants weekly. And there's a huge group of reviewers, and they're certainly, you know, they're looking at the financial situation of the organization, but they are looking at those, you know, has the organization been in operation for a long time? You know, what is the status of the board and the leadership? So there are other factors that come into play, and I wanted to highlight that, because sometimes when we think about sustainability, we go right to the money, but we have to remember that money is the means for us to deliver our mission, right? And so as we think about our sustainability during COVID-19, is to think about these aspects that are beyond the money part. And I wanted to start here because particularly for organizations that are shut down right now, I mean, clearly it's very, very difficult. And so mission relevancy might be a lot less during this time because you physically can't offer services. But I will say I've been really impressed with a lot of the arts organizations that quickly found ways for their patrons to engage in the arts online. So even if they may not be making, or people are not physically walking into the museums and art exhibitions, they've been able to experience that as well. So it's, how do you pivot? How do you adapt so that your mission remains relevant and valued by the community? Staying on top of those outcomes, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Leadership continuity. We've had a couple of announcements lately where leaders of some nonprofits have either resigned or have left their organizations. That's natural. It happens in regular times. So it's going to happen also during this time. The key is, how do you give confidence to your donors and to the community that you serve, that even with a person leaving, the leadership itself is in place. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then being able to ensure that your organization has the financial resources to get that done. So want to start talking first about what I'll call the mission focus, and thinking about how do you really focus your resources where they need to be. And so I always like to start with your customers and being very clear about who your customers are and what is their need right now. For those people who have lost their jobs, who have family members who are in crisis, their interests in your programs and services may be a lot less right now, or depending on the type of organization you are, they may be twice as great. So understanding the demand of your customers is a really important part, because that links back then to all of your financials. And what their demand is pre-COVID, right now during the sheltering in place, and then as we emerge out, is going to change. So based upon that customer demand, you can start to think about, okay, then what does that mean for the kinds of resources that we need to put in place? The second thing is understanding what is the market climate. And I did a little bit to share what some people are thinking, but the reality is this is considered to be an unknown situation for many economists. And we are now such a global society that it's not just what happens in the US can impact things. So, but you have to kind of put down some scenarios and best guess. And so understanding what the market climate looks like as it relates to your organization, and putting that down and having everyone agree these are the assumptions that we're using is really important. I was on a call earlier today with a nonprofit that has some retail side to them. And because of the governor's new orders, they're like, great, we can open up. But the question is, yes, now you can open up again, but the question is, are you actually going to get customers because of the kinds of services that you provide? So to what degree do you need to bring back staff for those positions? having clarity around those assumptions is important. Adapt and innovate. Many organizations were able to quickly move their staff from office locations into remote home-based locations. And I've heard from several executives that they actually can't believe how fast that happened. So being adaptive and ability to change and think differently about how you deliver your outcomes is an important part of the sustainability. And then, you know, directing your resources to those areas that are going to have the greatest impact is also critical. Some of our organizations, you know, over time, as we evolve, we might have donors that say, hey, we're interested in supporting this kind of program. We add it into the mix, but at this time when resources, particularly financial resources, are tight or customer demand is shrinking, you want to consider how you can direct your resources to the greatest outcome impact. And that, when we think about resources, is not just the money, it's your people, your processes, and your systems. And the last part on this is really thinking about how do you measure success at the Dana team. I'm sorry?
Good morning.
Good morning. The Dana team, when we first went into this, we recognized that some of the measurements that we had put in place for the year really were no longer even meaningful. So we tried to identify during this period of COVID-19, what are the performance metrics that we want to live up to so that we know that we were successful during this period. And then as we come out of this, we're going to need to pivot on that again. So having clarity around what success means during this time. And for some organizations, you may be looking at performance from a week-to-week or month-to-month basis, depending on how your organization is having to adapt to the customer demand and the market climate. Is there a question? Looks like somebody doesn't have their mute button on. Please mute. So here's the strategic question to ask your board and to think about as it relates to directing your resources. And thinking about how do you look at your assets, which is people, it's your processes, it's your brand, it's your facilities, it's your money. In what way at this time, and as you look into the future, are you investing your assets effectively and efficiently to achieve your community outcomes? And if there are areas where you're not being effective and efficient in doing that, can you walk away from them so that you can direct the remaining assets towards those in community impact? And then thinking about it again from a right now into future. And I'm going to give you some tools so that you can perhaps, if you're not able to answer this today, some tools that you'll be able to use to look at that. So first, thinking about your intended community outcomes. Have to bring this up. I will say that even more so today than in the past, if financial resources become tight, our donors are going to be looking at allocating their funding where they believe their dollars will have the greatest impact. And so encourage you that as you look at your communications, as you think about how you are messaging to your donors, how do you share with them the impact and the outcomes that you are trying to achieve? And even again, if it's during this period, our goal was for our clients to do blank, that still sends a message of success and focus. And then of course, as you emerge out of this, how do your outcomes evolve or change? So to give you an example, if you were a foundation and you were looking at two different types of programs that are in the financial literacy space, one of them will enroll 500 people compared to 400 last year. And the other was able to help 75 people remain in their homes compared to 72 last year. Which program do you think would you believe is the funder might fund? Or which one would you fund? Any thoughts? Megan? Oh, you just silenced yourself.
The one that keeps more people in their home, because the expense on our community for every person or family displaced from the home is far greater than we tend to calculate and monetize.
Okay, all right. Other thoughts?
I totally agree with Megan.
Anybody who disagrees? Yeah, from an outcome standpoint, a program where you know people will actually benefit from from that literacy program is probably a greater bet, right? Even though there's a lot of people that are accessing a financial literacy program, that first one doesn't really translate into what the actual outcomes of that work is. Now, who knows? It could actually have been the same program and the first step was this and the second step. But either way, thinking about that transformative change that you're trying to affect is really important communication. Encourage you to look at that. So having focus on your outcomes is important. And now we pivot to market climate. And there has been, these are a little bit dated now because they're all of like, March, different perspectives on what might happen out there. There's the doom and gloom. Nonprofits are going to be in trouble because they don't have a lot of resources, and that may take place, but also a lot of optimism, which is around the innovation and opportunities for rethinking how we provide services. So I like to focus more on the optimistic aspects. We do need to be highly realistic about our financial situation, but also think about how can we do things differently. So first step is really understanding where you actually are when it comes to your cash positions. So you've got a sense of what kind of outcomes you want to focus on, but do you have the resources in the right place to ensure that you can deliver on those particular program and outcome areas? And understanding cash flow is a really important tool to be able to give you that sense. And so here's an example of an organization that its cash flow kind of spikes over time, where it gets a lot of money in at one period, it consumes it, and then it gets more later. But, unfortunately, COVID-19 hits for this organization, and rather than having their desired 4 months of cash on hand, they're seeing their cash quickly going away. So we recommend that nonprofits have forward cash flow projections. Unfortunately, QuickBooks doesn't really do that work for you. So Dana did develop a cash flow tool and a guidance that walks you through it. And we even have a webinar so that you can actually see, okay, based upon my assumptions is by July 1st, we'll be open and running and everything's fine. And here's what our cash projections look like. Or maybe we can't really get back up to what we were doing until September. And this is what our cash projection looks like. It helps you understand what resources you have available and then make choices around how you deploy those resources. We found that in our study and what we saw also from the chamber study, that a lot of organizations are struggling with cash on hand. And it's one of the reasons why we pursued a special line of SBA funding for nonprofits for the Paycheck Protection Program through the SBA. If you've not applied for that, and there's still funding left at the SBA, so you can still do that. And interestingly, it varied by types of organizations. The nonprofits that had the least amount of cash relative to others was actually those that had contracts with state government. And so we're mindful that when our monies are tied up to restrictions, it really does make it harder to be flexible at points like this. So the degree in which, again, you can help encourage your donors to unrestrict cash, definitely encourage you to do so. Wanted to offer up a couple of things about thinking about your forward cash flow projections. First is to do some very short term, the next 30 days and the next 60 days. You may even want to look at it on either days of cash on hand or weeks of cash on hand, depending on your organization. Where can you reduce your spending? Where can you redirect resources? If you have restricted money, can you go back? One organization actually went to some of their major gift donors that had contributed to their endowment and asked permission to unrestrict a portion of that funding so that they could continue their operations. Seeking those short-term opportunities for liquidity, whether it's a line of credit or for some of these loans. And where possible, see if you're, like, for example, let's say you've got a lease. Is it possible that you can come up with a different payment plan so that you're still paying on your lease, but maybe you're not putting as much pressure on a time that you don't have as much cash coming in? Then, because the world is not going to rebound by the next 30 days, at least that's not what I think, I do recommend that you then look at a 3, 6, 9 month cash flow projection. If you have certain, let's say, fundraising events that you typically do in the fall, one, are you even planning to have them? If you are, what do you think the financial outcome will look like? So that, again, you can kind of see how your cash on hand is going to fluctuate over time. Because we now know that the governor is going to be coming out with plans around phases, phase 1, 2, and 3, you may want to think about it in that context. I don't think we will have the luxury over the next couple of months to not be laser focused on mission critical areas. And so encourage you to think about what that looks like over the long term. Finding partners. We certainly have been promoting in good times the need for collaboration and partnership, but I think it's even more critical now. I will tell you that I saw the value of partnerships and how quickly agencies that had strong partnerships were able to find solutions. Because they had relationships with other executive directors, they were able to quickly, collectively brainstorm on solutions and then take an action that allowed all of them to pivot the way they needed to pivot. I think about the relationship that I have with the CEOs of the United Way, the Philanthropy Delaware, and the DCF, because we had been meeting, we meet regularly and had already done some joint things together. We were able to, within a week, create that COVID emergency response initiative. And we wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't have those relationships and partnerships. So I think going forward, it's going to be even more critical to find them. And we're happy to help facilitate them if you need a little extra help there. Finally, I think it's important to communicate to your donors so they understand what your plans are and what you're trying to do. And, you know, at times like this, not having cash is not necessarily because your organization or your board was not fiscally responsible, right? It's because the conditions have created a lot of hardship for everyone. And so being honest with your donors and sharing with them where you are, what you're trying to accomplish, how you're focusing your resources can give them confidence that you're on top of this. It may be at some point the best way to sustain your mission is not to remain as a separate entity. It may be that it's best to sustain your mission by creating a strategic alliance or a merger or some other new structure. If you've set your donors up with, as they've walked the journey with you, that may not become as much of a surprise down the road. So working with your donors, being transparent, I think is always a good thing. So just a couple of things around funding opportunities if you're not aware. I've already mentioned the PPP loans. The Delaware, the DCF, the fund that's at DCF as part of the COVID Emergency Response Initiative is starting to expand the types of grants that they'll make. We honestly thought that when we started that the United Way Fund, which was a rapid response fund, very targeted towards housing and food and financial assistance, we thought, great, we've got that covered. But very quickly, in the mass amount of layoffs that took place, the Strategic Response Fund also needed to respond to those critical needs. Now that some federal dollars are starting to flow in, the state is starting to kind of create new contracts, things are starting to settle, the pressure on the DCF fund for critical services is lessening, and so it is opening up. And for arts and environmental organizations, I'm sure you're happy to hear that. I also encourage you to visit Philanthropy Delaware's website. Cynthia's team has been trying to put there any grants that they see that could be applicable to nonprofits in Delaware. And I'll add that we are meeting with DEMA, the Delaware Emergency Management Association, to understand how which nonprofits could qualify for FEMA funding. And as soon as we find that out, we'll let you know. Understanding to what degree you can operate business as usual. With the rollout phases, each organization may be impacted differently. Recognize that there may be a fall resurgence that could cause us to go back. So thinking about how do you set yourself up to kind of pivot as you need. And for all of us, recognize there's going to be an incremental cost associated with creating safe work environments. We are doing our best to find a way that nonprofits can access masks and cleaning solutions and other materials at a reasonable price. We've even asked the governor's office if there's any way that through their purchasing, nonprofits would be able to buy into that somehow. So not sure of a solution yet, but we do recognize that that's going to be a considerable cost for nonprofits. The unknown is the degree and length and time of economic recession. You know, the Economist, as I said, was suggesting that'll definitely be through the rest of this year. So as you think about your projections, you may want to consider, you know, your assumptions around improvement and recession. And again, the two key factors there are unemployment and what the financial markets will do. I think those tend to have an impact on our donations and people's interest in being able to access and serve programs. The last thing that just to keep in mind is the state budget. We are meeting actually later today with the Office of Management and Budget to talk about their assumptions, what they believe they're going to be able to tap of the stimulus money to help offset some of the increased costs of the state. I know the governor has been very clear that the rosy budget that he presented back in January is not going to be the case. Our job, and certainly encourage you to speak to your legislators, is to really speak about how important it is that these organizations, your organizations that are creating really important impact in community, remain solvent. I wanted to share this with you. It actually is adapted from one of our sister organizations in Michigan around how you might want to think about framing your kind of mission impact areas, your financial and how you evolve as the reopening happens. So this is just an example that you can take with you where you can look at, okay, and these different columns are different stages of opening, right? So currently we're in this shutdown phase. What are the outcomes that you're trying to achieve during this phase? What's your fundraising and your programmatic areas? What's your staffing? What key assumptions do you have related to your operations? And then consequently, based on your financial modeling and your cash flow projection, what does your cash position look like? And then, laying it out then for the different phases. This is a simple, almost like dashboard. Hopefully behind that, you'd have your different detailed plans. But I wanted to offer this up as perhaps a way to think about how you might frame the financial needs and your mission impact in a way that you can present this to your board and work with your staff. Stop there for a second to see if there are any questions. Nope, okay. A couple of resources that can help. Yes.
Can you share that document by email?
Absolutely.
As a template?
Yep, it's like an Excel spreadsheet, so happy to.
Fine.
Yeah.
Thank
and
you.
You can change the colors if you want.
Can you share the slides of the entire presentation?
Yes, yes. So actually, I'll share with you, I'll send this, the presentation, PowerPoint, and then I've got a couple articles I was going to send to you. One is some considerations around leadership, and the other one's around considerations around sustainability. So all of that will come out after this presentation. So a couple resources that if you're thinking about, all right, how do I understand which of my areas are high impact areas and also generate the kind of net revenue that we need. Steve Zimmerman and GD Bell came out with the sustainability mindset, and I love it. I use it a lot. They were actually at our conference a couple years ago, and all of their templates are online and they're free. So it really does a great job of helping you think about where your programs, and by the way, they include fundraising events as part of this, right? Because fundraising does take resources to really help you see where you may have areas that right now are not as important. You don't put as much resources towards it, and areas that are high impact and high net return. So one resource that you can use, and if you need some help, we're happy to walk you through this. I've used this with some strategic planning work with nonprofits to really get a sense of how over time their program profitability might shift based upon their planning. The other thing is, for those of you who might be Jim Collins fans, he wrote the book Good to Great. And one of the things that Jim looked at is, why is it that some companies, no matter what the conditions of the market, continue to excel, and therefore they're great companies, while others just kind of get by, or in some cases don't fail. And one of the key aspects that he honed in on is really being clear about what you're really, really good at, what you're passionate about, and what drives your economic engine, and focusing in on that intersection. And they call that a hedgehog. I've kind of expanded a bit, because his book is very much about the company, and as nonprofits, we operate in a system. So I also ask you to think about, well, who else cares about what you're passionate about? Because those are the individuals and or organizations that can partner with you and help you think about bringing resources. So imagine again that we're part of a system. I think about, Pam's organization. Her organization is linked to what happens at Nemours, and so they're part of a system, and there's partnerships that that exist so that she can be efficient and effective for her clients, and they can be efficient and effective for theirs. So thinking about that, having a systems lens as you look at your hedgehog for your organization. I'm going to wrap it up with some things about leadership. There's a couple of really great articles out there, and again, we summarize them for you in a kind of like a one-pager from the Cotter. But I think the first thing is, the difference between leadership and management is leadership is about creating vision. And I should also say that leadership is not one person. Leadership is a process. It's actually a capacity within an organization. And, Megan said earlier that leadership continuity is really key. People may come and go. I mean, eventually we are all going to leave our organizations at some point. The key, though, is we want to make sure that the leadership of the organization is sound. So having a clear vision, even if it's a clear vision for the next 30 days, 60 days, and then into the future. Ensuring you have the right people and that they're prepared and have the confidence and the competence to be able to make the shifts that you believe is necessary during this time. Working on processes. I can tell you that even though Dana has offered a lot of workshops and even webinars in the past, we have never operated at the pace and transition that we've had. And so we found that some of our processes that worked well in the office, like my shouting across the hallway to Paul to ask him if he's met with somebody, doesn't work anymore, right? So our processes have to change, and how do you help navigate that? And again, being able to quickly deploy resources or redeploy into different ways again and again. One nonprofit executive realized that half her staff who were in the program area were completely swamped, or the other half of the staff that tended to be in the administrative area didn't have as much to do. And so wanting to ensure that everybody could still keep their job, she did cross-training so that some of the admin folks were able to help support in the program area, which freed up then the program folks to do more service and to meet their increased demand. So kind of thinking creatively about how your staff can possibly be redeployed during this period so that they can contribute and you can continue to pay them. The last thing is just thinking about your organization itself and how you think about adapting it. And this gets a little bit into culture perspective and thinking about how do you how do you retain an adaptive culture? Again, so many people shared with me they can't believe how quickly they moved from being in office to remote. And probably if you had asked them 6 months ago, well, what if you had to quickly in 1 week turn on a dime, they probably would have said, not possible, but they made it happen. We don't want to have to be adaptive just because we're in crisis. I think that what we've learned in the past couple of years and certainly going forward is the world is going to change and evolve. So how do you create an environment where your team and your organization is adaptive? What's the value proposition? And recognizing that customer demand and market climate are going to change what value means is how do you focus on the value and less about what you do so that your value proposition is always out there. Creating decision-making throughout the organization. Back in the 70s and 80s, you know, there's the top-down hierarchy. How do you start to empower your team members who are working in their homes and working remotely to be able to make decisions so that you can speed up your customer service and those pivots that you might need to make. This is something that I've been really reflecting a lot on lately, is that moving from being kind of that top-down hierarchical perspective to thinking about your team, thinking about your board, thinking about your partners as all part of a network, as part of a system. And each person and each group has a role that they play. And in what way does that network need to be strengthened so that if one isn't working as well, you've got the others to support. And so wanted to throw that in there. And finally, cultivating purpose, values, connections to your team so that they trust each other. And again, in this kind of environment where we're working remotely, that they know that they can pick up the phone, get on a Zoom call and share something that they would have rather have done in person, but they can't, they need to. And finally, focusing on that performance. Performance matters. With very limited resources, we want to make sure that we direct them to the greatest output. We want to make sure that we are able to provide feedback and continuously improve. And that's not just for our programs, but it's for our people, it's for our executives, and it's for the board. Great article came out in late 2017 called Organizing in the Age of Urgency. That'll also be in your reading packet because I think it really does a nice job talking about how an organization can be adaptive in these times. And I'll wrap it up then just with the need to be communicative to your board, to your team members, and to your community. And however you do it, this is how the Boys and Girls shares their impact story with their donors. If you can do it in a simple method and like in an infographic, it even helps. But communication now more than ever is so important. It helps people stay connected, and particularly for those stakeholders that you rely on, it helps them understand what's needed and how they can be part of it. So with that, I'm going to stop. We have a couple of minutes left to see if there are any questions.
Sheila?
Yes.
One thing I want to emphasize is things you've mentioned already, but just to re-emphasize, Wilmington Youth Rowing, like most youth athletics, is suffering right now. Excuse me. And so we've worked, we're forming an alliance with several other youth nonprofits that focus on athletics. We're working with 3 youth nonprofits that focus on sociocultural and academic, so that we can put together initially a virtual program for youth at risk. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully as we come out of this later in the summer, then go into an alliance where we can do face-to-face. And that alliance, we've already put in grants with Welfare and Longwood and Cressley, so that we can together reach our constituency and at the same time have the funding for each of us.
That's great. And what I've had a chance to hear about that from some others, and you know, here's a great example where they're all kind of in similar space, but do things differently. But some of the things they do are probably the same. And if they can think about how they do it together, and collectively brainstorm, it helps them solve those challenges more quickly. So congratulations on that. That's great. Other questions? Well, I want to thank you for being here today, and great to see many of you. We are, as part of, we'll send out the packet material, as I mentioned. I'll also include a little brief survey. That's one of the ways that we can make sure that we're putting our resources to where it matters most. So that feedback helps us pivot. And please continue to look at our website and on our newsletters. We are working on some additional resources to help support you as you think about how you emerge out of the situation. So we've got some HR resources that are coming online. And then of course, if you do need any assistance in either this cash flow projection, we have some financial analysts who've donated their time to help you walk through that. We also have consultants that can help you with strategy and support. So our job is to be here for you, to help you guys so that you can be strong in the future. And of course, stay tuned as we learn more about what's happening with our state budget. We'll certainly keep you apprised there. So with that, if there are no other questions, we'll call it a day and we can all go out and change the world. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Sheila.
everyone.
Have a great day.
Thanks, you
Thank
too.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.